It is the 15th of December 2008, and the Honda Racing F1 factory in Brackley, Northamptonshire, is silent. 2 days earlier, Honda Motor Company had announced the immediate withdrawal of its Formula One operation. Not a phased reduction, not a partnership restructure, but a complete and immediate exit. The decision had been made in Tokyo in response to a global financial crisis that had reduced Honda's automotive revenue by a figure that made the annual Formula One budget of approximately $300 million impossible to justify. The 800 employees at Brackley had been told their jobs would end within weeks unless a buyer could be found. The car they had been developing for the 2009 season, a car that had consumed an entire year of aerodynamic development under the most significant regulatory change in a decade, was sitting in the factory completed, tested, and without an engine contract, a driver lineup, or a title sponsor. Ross Brawn, who had been running the technical operation at Brackley since leaving Ferrari in 2006, had 48 hours to decide whether to walk away or to do something that no one in the history of Formula One had previously attempted. By the time you understand what Brawn did in the following 11 weeks and what happened at the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne on the 29th of March 2009, you will understand why the Brawn BGP 001 is the most improbable championship-winning car in the history of the sport, and why its improbability was not accidental. This is the story of the Brawn BGP 001, a car built by a team that did not exist, on a budget that was not sufficient, with an engine that was not designed for it, and a technical advantage that every rival had been given the opportunity to find and had missed. To understand what the BGP 001 was, you need to understand what the 2009 technical regulations were designed to do and what they accidentally permitted. The FIA's regulatory overhaul for 2009 was the most comprehensive since the 1998 changes that had reset the aerodynamic landscape and handed Adrian Newey his first McLaren championship. The primary objectives were threefold: reduce aerodynamic downforce to lower cornering speeds, reduce aerodynamic turbulence to permit closer racing, and transfer aerodynamic performance from the complex multi-element wings and bargeboard arrays that had defined the previous decade towards simpler, more standardized surfaces. Front wings were widened and simplified. Rear wings were narrowed and raised. The aerodynamic devices mounted between the front and rear axles, the cascades, the turning vanes, the floor-mounted aerodynamic elements were heavily restricted. The kinetic energy recovery system, which harvested braking energy and returned it as an electrical boost of approximately 80 horsepower for 6.7 seconds per lap, was introduced as a mandatory development option. The regulations were published in final form in the spring of 2008, giving every team on the grid a full season to develop their 2009 car in parallel with racing the 2008 car. The double diffuser was in the regulations from the day they were published. It was not hidden, it was not obscure. The relevant Article 3.120.7 of the 2009 FIA Technical Regulations governing the geometry of the rear diffuser contained language that described the permitted diffuser volume in terms that were, depending on the interpretation applied to two specific sentences in the document, either restrictive or permissive about the routing of additional airflow into the diffuser's upper tier. The restrictive interpretation, adopted by Ferrari, McLaren, Renault, BMW, and every other major team that studied the regulations, held that the article prohibited any secondary airflow path into the diffuser above the reference plane. The permissive interpretation, developed independently by the aerodynamic teams at Honda Racing, Toyota, and Williams, held that the article permitted secondary openings in the diffuser floor, provided those openings were located within the specific geometric boundaries the article defined. The two interpretations produced aerodynamic devices of radically different performance. The standard single-tier diffuser that the restrictive interpretation permitted generated a specific rear downforce figure, The double diffuser that the permissive interpretation allowed generated approximately 60% more rear downforce from the same regulatory envelope. Nick Fry, the Honda Racing chief executive, had identified the double diffuser as a potential performance advantage in mid-2008 and had committed the team's aerodynamic resource to developing it. By the time Honda announced its withdrawal in December 2008, the BGP 001's aerodynamic package, including a double diffuser whose performance advantage over the expected field was, by Honda's internal calculations, in the range of half a second to 0.8 of a second per lap, depending on circuit, was complete. The car had been wind tunnel tested. The correlation between wind tunnel data and computational fluid dynamics modeling had been validated. The device worked. The team that had built it was being dissolved. Brawn negotiated the purchase of the factory, the intellectual property, and the car from Honda for a nominal sum reported as £1 sterling, a figure that reflected Honda's desire for a clean exit rather than any assessment of the asset's value. The asset's value, had Honda understood what its aerodynamic team had built, was a Formula One World Championship. Brawn did not have an engine. The Mercedes V8 unit that had powered the McLaren MP4/23 to Lewis Hamilton's 2008 title was available as a customer supply, but the Mercedes engine's dimensional envelope was different from the Honda unit. The BGP 001's rear suspension and aerodynamic package had been designed around. The installation required structural modifications that were completed in approximately 6 weeks. The modifications compromised the car's weight distribution by moving mass rearward from the design center of gravity. The compromise was accepted. There was no alternative. Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello were retained as drivers on contracts whose financial terms were renegotiated to reflect a team that was, in the weeks before the season opener, genuinely uncertain whether it could fund a full season of racing. The title sponsor search produced no result. The car raced in white with the Brawn GP name and a small number of minor sponsor logos. In the paddock, the assessment of the team's prospects ranged from sympathetic to dismissive. A team that had lost its manufacturer backing, its engine partner, its budget, and most of its senior staff in a 3-month period was not, by any conventional analysis, a championship contender. The car it was about to unveil had not been seen publicly. Nobody outside the factory knew what was inside the diffuser. Melbourne answered the question before the first race had been run. In qualifying, Button took pole position with a lap of 1 minute 26.202 seconds. Barrichello qualified second. The next fastest car, the Toyota of Jarno Trulli, was 0.7 of a second behind. Ferrari's Kimi Raikkonen was 0.9 adrift. McLaren's Hamilton was over a second slower. The entire front row of the grid was white. In the Ferrari garage, the technical team's initial response was to examine the bronze rear diffuser through photographs taken during the pre-race inspection period. What they saw confirmed the interpretation they had rejected the previous year. The double diffuser was legal. They had the regulations in front of them. They had had the regulations in front of them for 12 months. Ferrari lodged a protest. So did Renault. So did BMW. The stewards reviewed the regulations and dismissed every protest. Article 3.12.7, properly read, permitted the device. The Brawn BGP 001 was legal. Button won the race by a margin of 23 seconds. Stay with this, because the 7 races that followed Melbourne are the part of the 2009 season that the championship narrative compresses without examining what produced them. Button won in Malaysia, he won in Bahrain, he won in Spain, he won in Monaco, he won in Turkey. 6 wins from the first 7 races, a sequence that recalled the dominant opening runs of the Williams FW14B in 1992 and the Ferrari F2004 in 2004. Produced by a team running on emergency funding, a compromised engine installation, and a chassis whose weight distribution had been shifted by a last-minute mechanical adaptation, the double diffuser advantage was real and measurable. It was also being closed closed, Toyota and Williams had their own double diffusers from the season's opening race. Ferrari, McLaren, and Renault introduced their versions at the Spanish Grand Prix in May. By mid-season, the field had converged. The exclusive aerodynamic advantage that had produced 6 wins in 7 races had been neutralized within 10 weeks of Melbourne. What happened next revealed something about the BGP001 that the double diffuser discussion had partially obscured. The car, without its exclusive aerodynamic advantage, was still fast. Not as fast as it had been in the first 7 races, fast enough to remain competitive against Ferrari and McLaren machinery that had substantially larger development budgets and full manufacturer support. The reason was the same reason that Ross Brawn's previous championship cars had always been competitive across full seasons, not peak performance in any single variable, but consistency and balance across the range of conditions a full season produced. The BGP001's aerodynamic concept, even without the double diffuser exclusivity, maintained a balance between front and rear downforce that produced tire behavior across race distances that Brawn's operational team, which retained the strategic expertise that had won championships at Benetton and Ferrari, could exploit through pit stop timing and fuel strategy in a manner that raw pace alone could not replicate. Button's championship lead, which had been enormous in the first half of the season, was progressively reduced through the summer. Barrichello won twice in the second half of the year. Sebastian Vettel in the Red Bull RB5 won 6 races from the German Grand Prix onward and finished the season second in the championship. Button arrived at the Brazilian Grand Prix in São Paulo with a lead of 14 points with 2 races remaining. He finished 5th. He arrived in Abu Dhabi for the finale, needing a single point to secure the title regardless of what anyone else did. He qualified 6th. On lap 1, he was involved in contact that dropped him to last place. He drove from last to 5th across 70 laps. He took the championship by 11 points over Barrichello, his own teammate, and 18 points over Vettel. The Brawn BGP001 won 8 races. Its constructor won the championship at the first attempt, the only time in the sport's history that a constructor has achieved that result. The double diffuser that had made it possible was banned for 2010, incorporated into the regulations in a manner that removed the performance differential while retaining the concept. Ross Brawn sold the team to Mercedes at the end of the season for a sum that was not disclosed but was understood to be substantially more than £1. The factory at Brackley became the Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team, which would go on to win 7 consecutive Constructors' Championships between 2014 and 2020. The BGP001 itself, the white car with no title sponsor that had won a championship on emergency funding in its first season, was preserved in the Mercedes collection and displayed at the team's museum in Brackley. The regulation that produced the BGP001's advantage had been available to every team for 12 months. The interpretation that unlocked it had been reached independently by 3 teams. The other teams had studied the same document and reached a different conclusion. The performance consequence of that interpretive difference, half a second to 0.8 per lap, 6 wins from 7 races, a world championship, is the clearest possible demonstration of what Formula One regulation reading, done with sufficient care and without the constraint of assumptions about what a rule is intended to mean, can produce. The FIA writes regulations to define what is permitted. The engineers who find the space between what is written and what was intended win championships. Ross Brawn had been doing exactly that since 1994. In 2009, he did it one final time, from a factory he had bought for £1, in a car nobody expected to see on the grid, with a device that had been in plain sight for a year. If this is the kind of engineering history that brought you here, subscribe. It is the only way this channel keeps producing the stories that the race reports leave out. Leave a comment. Is the Brawn BGP001 the greatest underdog story in Formula One history, or just the most ruthless exploitation of a regulatory oversight the sport has ever seen? Next time, We go inside the car that carried software the FIA found in a season that cost one driver his championship and another his life.